Hi, everyone, and welcome to Asheville's Monuments, Past, Present, and Future, a virtual symposium. I'm Trevor Freeman. I'm the Public Programs Director for the Western North Carolina Historical Association. In just a moment, I will introduce you to our speakers and moderator, but first I want to say a little bit about this program. This event is brought to you by the Western North Carolina Historical Association, based out of the Smith McDowell House Museum here in Asheville. We also greatly appreciate our co-hosts and co-organizers, the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at UNC Asheville, without whom this event would not be possible. Our city of Asheville, like many of others, is currently wrestling with the meanings and fates of many controversial statues and monuments. This symposium today aims to help facilitate community engagement and dialogue in advance of the Vance Monument Task Force's anticipated report in mid-November with the recommendations for the Vance Monument and for Pack Square. This event today features several notable scholars who we hope can provide some historical and social context amid these decisions. They will also field audience questions at the end. We ask that you submit questions in the Q&A feature, and we will pose them to our panel at the conclusion of presentations. And now to introduce our guests. First up, our moderator today is Jim Stokely. Jim, a talented writer himself, is the president of the Wilma Dykeman Legacy, which sponsors events that reflect the values of the famous author and historian Wilma Dykeman. These include social and environmental justice. Our first speaker today is Dr. Steven Nash. Dr. Nash is an associate professor of history at East Tennessee State University and the author of Reconstruction's Ragged Edge, The Politics of Post-War Life in the Southern Mountains, among many other publications. Speaking second today is Dr. Dwight Mullen, Professor Emeritus in the Department of Political Science at the University of North Carolina at Asheville. As a teaching professor, Dr. Mullen was committed to both the students and to being professionally active. Specifically, he offered courses in public policy, American politics, and African-American politics. His scholarly activities included panels chaired and papers presented at meetings of the National Conference of Black Political Scientists, overseeing undergraduates' research projects covering the state of Black Asheville, and serving in local, state, national, and international capacities that aim to improve the delivery of public services to underserved populations. And last but not least is Dr. Fitzhugh Brundage, the William B. Umstead Distinguished Professor in the Department of History at the University of North Carolina. Dr. Brundage's research are American history since the Civil War, with a particular focus on the American South. He has written on lynching, utopian socialism in the New South, white and Black historical memory in the South since the Civil War, and the history of torture in the United States from the time of European contact to the 21st century. His current research project is a study of Civil War prisoner of war camps. And now, without any further delay, I will turn this over to our moderator, Jim Stokely. Jim?
Thank you, Trevor. As Trevor Freeman just said, today's program is taking place within the context of the Vance Monument Task Force. This task force, composed of 6 members appointed by the Asheville City Council, plus 6 members appointed by the Buncombe County Commission, was formed in August of 2020 and has been meeting weekly to figure out how to replace or alter the Vance Monument in such a manner as to honor the local history of African Americans. Our first speaker this afternoon is Dr. Steve Nash. You heard from Trevor Freeman that Dr. Nash is Associate Professor of History at East Tennessee State University, just across the state line in Johnson City, Tennessee. What you did not hear is that Dr. Nash lives in Weaverville, North Carolina, and commutes as necessary across Sam's Gap whenever he teaches classes in person. Today, Dr. Nash will speak to us about the legacy of Zebulon Vance and his commemoration elsewhere in North Carolina, as well as Statuary Hall in the U.S. Capitol building. Dr. Nash.
Thank you, Jim. It's a real pleasure to be here and be part of this panel. And it's a very unusual situation for someone of my size and slowness to bat lead off. So I'm going to do my very best to try to get on base and give an opportunity for our cleanup hitters to sort of come along and bring me home. I think our topics today, as you're going to hear them, fit together extremely well. And I take my task as sort of being the setup to talk about Zebulon Vance in history and in memory. So we're going to talk today about Zebulon Vance in history and in memory. In one of his first public speeches after the end of the Civil War, Zebulon Vance lectured University of North Carolina students on the duties of defeat. Amidst his review of Confederate defeat and the destruction of the Southern social system built upon slavery, Vance encouraged the students to lead the state forward. His audience were young white men, likely sons, brothers, cousins of Confederate soldiers, and Vance played upon their heartstrings. Referring to the men lost on distant battlefields, Vance said that, quote, "the very least that we can do is to bring the remains home and bury them with decency and in silence." At that time, tombstones were the most pressing monuments in the former governor's mind. Quote, "no monuments of victory are for us. No national jubilee can we celebrate. No songs of triumph can our maidens sing. Our garlands of glory weave, or garlands of glory weave. We are all alone with our great defeat and that heavy sorrow," Vance said. But one day, the former governor added, quote, "I doubt not that monuments of marble and granite will tell the stranger how North Carolina cherishes the memory of her illustrious children." Marble and granite monuments would, of course, come in time as North Carolinians honored white men associated with the Confederacy. Zebulon Vance has perhaps been memorialized more than any North Carolinian associated with the Civil War. There's the obelisk in Pack Square in Asheville, and a pair of statues, one on the state capitol grounds in Raleigh and another in Statuary Hall in the US Capitol. These monuments highlight the tension between history and memory. If these monuments do tell strangers how North Carolina cherishes its illustrious children, then why did they choose Zebulon B. Vance? The history is clear. Zebulon Vance is one of the most consequential historical figures of the 19th century in North Carolina history. As a congressman before the war, Zebulon Vance defended the South and its peculiar institution of slavery. Personally, he and his family enslaved men and women of color. He believed that that was his right, and he believed that enslavement was the proper condition of African Americans. In these views and practices, he was neither exceptional nor unique. Vance achieved his fame, however, during the American Civil War. Elected governor in 1862 as something of a moderate, Vance was during the secession winter of 1860-61 what would be known as a conditional unionist. What that meant is that he preached a sort of adherence and a loyalty to the Union up to a certain point, and that certain point was typically understood as the United States attempting to coerce the seceded states back into the Union. Vance would then go on into the Confederate Army, rise in rank, and then in 1862 he would run as governor. And again, because of his conditional unionism, he was seen as something of a moderate, not an ardent secessionist, but something of a moderate. As governor, Zebulon Vance faced a rather daunting task. The state was divided, and Vance worked diligently to keep the state divided in its loyalties, steadfastly behind the Confederacy. Internal divisions forced Vance to balance both state and national interests. Still, he deemed Confederate independence a matter of both state and personal honor, even as he confessed his private doubts that the great popular heart was never behind the war. And to be clear, in talking about Vance's views of honor, both state and personal, he saw the preservation of slavery as a central part of that honor. When confronted with defeat and Reconstruction, Zebulon Vance was defiant. He accepted slavery's demise, but not Black equal citizenship. never equality. In fact, he worked as diligently to overthrow Reconstruction as he did to secure Confederate independence. And here I would highlight that the sort of biography of record now is Gordon B. McKinney's biography of Zebulon Vance. And McKinney makes a persuasive argument that in the aftermath of the Civil War, Vance, as a political leader, even though he was unable to hold office, as a political leader for his party, which was then known as the Conservative Party, that Vance was sort of the architect of a strategy, a political strategy of using race as a way of trying to divide North Carolinians, divide white North Carolinians from the former enslaved people, and to use that as a sort of galvanizing issue to try to lead his political party back into power across the state. So Vance was a critical figure in the sort of push to overthrow what was at that point a biracial state government that was taking form in Reconstruction in North Carolina. And in this endeavor, in his sort of resistance to Reconstruction, Zebulon Vance proved more successful, perhaps, than he did as a wartime governor. He would sort of seek political office at different times. Vance's ambition was, in fact, to be a United States senator. However, he was unable to hold office under the terms of the 14th Amendment. Vance would try to seek the Senate, would have to sort of refuse it when he would not be seated. And ultimately in 1876, he kind of concedes to run for governor again. He aspired for larger office, national office. But in 1876, he concedes that he will run for governor and does so against a very able and popular Republican opponent by the name of Thomas Suttle Jr. Vance would win in a contested election in 1876, which put the idea of the Civil War very much before voters. Vance was at this time a Democrat, again, running as a Democrat, and was using the idea of his wartime record to offset the so-called abuses of Reconstruction. He defeated he defeated Settle in 1876 and once again assumed the position of governor of North Carolina. As governor again, Vance would push hard for the completion of the Western North Carolina Railroad to Asheville. And that railroad would ultimately be completed under his successor after Vance finally achieved his appointment as United States Senator in 1878. But still, as governor and then as a backer of the railroad, Vance helped ensure that hundreds of Black men would labor in pseudo-slavery as convict laborers in treacherous conditions to complete the Western North Carolina Railroad to his town of Asheville. As a senator, Vance's legacy is that of humor and pro-South advocacy. Even as his state fractured along class and racial lines in the 1880s and 1890s, Vance remained largely popular, ostensibly with his white constituents, for his wit, off-color jokes, and popular speeches. Ironically, he would die in 1894 in the midst of the biggest political crisis in the state since Reconstruction, something that perhaps saved him from a somewhat epic political sort of fall from grace, something that I hope we can talk about perhaps in the Q&A. That is Vance's career in a nutshell. And my sketch is admittedly brief, and I welcome questions about specific elements of his life and career after all of our speakers. But that brief outline allows us now to turn our attention toward the issue of memory and the commemoration of the history that Zebulon Vance sort of lived. Zebulon Vance, ever the politician, played a leading role in this as well. Vance cultivated his image carefully and shaped his legacy through the last half of the 19th century. He had earned the moniker War Governor of the South, a reputation that he capitalized on in every meaning of the word. In political campaigns, he carefully portrayed himself as the champion of personal liberty. He and he alone among Confederate governors, the story goes, stood up against the centralizing power of Jefferson Davis's Confederate government. Only Vance, he and his supporters would proudly argue, managed to feed and equip their state soldiers through state-run blockade running. These twin wartime policies allowed Vance to portray himself after the war politically as the ultimate protector of the state's white population and the archetypal political leader in the Confederate mantle of states' rights. I would in fact argue that in some ways, Zebulon Vance tried to out states' rights the Confederacy, that ostensibly putting himself forward as this man who protected individual liberty, even against Jefferson Davis, demonstrated that he was perhaps a more true representation of the Confederate political ideal. That streamlined and simplified version of his record, however, because remember, the war was messy and complex and the loyalties were divided, and Vance is trying to balance national as well as state level interests. So that sort of complexity gets lost behind these sort of twin versions, these twin issues that Vance pushes as his legacy. And that simplified version of his record obscures the divisions, the conflicts within North Carolina, while creating a facade in the post-war state of white unity. These same themes permeate the commemoration of Vance's life. If you read the eulogies, the dedications, the speeches, where does the weight of Zebulon Vance's accomplishment and his fame typically fall? Where do people typically talk about? What are the things that they highlight in terms of Zebulon Vance's career, his legacy, what he accomplished? Well, we can look here at a couple different options. And you'll forgive my chronological messiness that these are not arranged necessarily in the order that I suspect most people are familiar with the monument in the middle. The same sort of themes of commemoration, the same sort of themes of defender of civil liberties, the sort of provider through state-run blockade running. When you read the eulogies, those issues continuously pop up. Those are kind of the go-to of the Vance image. A public declaration of esteem for Vance's memory took place here in his native Buncombe County in December of 1897. As the audience wiped the snow from their eyes, they lent their ears to Reverend Dr. R.R. Swope, who believed that Vance, quote, resented all abuse of authority by the military powers, unquote, to the point of, quote, being hostile to the Confederate cause. And this is a really sort of interesting sort of example of how Vance's memory evolved and how he was sort of commemorated and the sort of roles that are played in this. Because as you get into the 20th century, some of the historians in the early sort of looking at the Confederacy would actually argue, and thinking specifically of Frank Owsley, that the Confederacy was killed by states' rights, that the sort of lack of central control and the sort of unwillingness of the states to abide by national necessity, people like Zebulon Vance were a problem, that they obstructed. And here R.R. Swope seems to be kind of building on that, right? That here perhaps he suggests that Vance could have even been hostile to the Confederate cause. But you can see how that quickly gets spun then, because the Confederate cause becomes sort of a stand-in for Jefferson Davis and the Confederate government. Because then Swope would continue that for Southerners devoted to the cause of individual liberty, Swope would argue, it was Vance's, quote, proud distinction that in North Carolina of all the states, north or south, the writ of habeas corpus was at no time suspended during the war. The writ of habeas corpus, of course, is the writ that brings you before a judge when you're charged with a crime. That Vance did not suspend the writ of habeas corpus. So you can see, in a sense, how Swope is sort of building this legacy, that Vance, you can spin the sort of resistance to Confederate centralized authority into this protection of defender of personal liberties. And I think it's important to keep in mind the backdrop of what's going on during the 1890s when this commemoration is taking place. As I mentioned earlier, North Carolina is fracturing again politically in the 1880s and 1890s. Young Democrats and others, generally lower class whites, are moving due to economic hardships and others towards groups like the Farmers Alliance and ultimately into populism. The Republican Party in the state was battered but not gone, not broken. And in the 1890s, you see this political fusion that takes place between the Republicans and these sort of disaffected white North Carolinians. It's often referred to as political fusion in the 1890s. And they seize control. They gain control through elections of the state government. They enact a variety of reforms within the state government. And again, a sort of specter of biracial political sort of resistance to the Democrats is taking control. Vance dies in 1894, right as that is sort of hitting its stride. And afterwards comes the commemoration. And it's against that backdrop of this sort of renewed biracial political coalition that this commemoration of Zebulon Vance really sort of takes hold, that the monument is put up in Pack Square. In a sense, this is a test as to whether or not the memory, the legacy that Zebulon Vance and others have been building could in fact still unite whites during a time of political crisis. It's also important to keep in mind that it's at this time that, finding that this might not work, they turn towards violence, frequently using racialized violence, as was seen in the coup in Wilmington in 1898, and then ultimately North Carolina moving towards the disfranchisement of African American voters by 1900. It's those events, the sort of collapse of populism and fusion, the violent resistance and violent political action, the coup in Wilmington and disfranchisement, that makes the sort of ceremonies of the next two Vance monuments appear to be something of a victory party for white Democrats. On August 22nd, 1900, Vance's friend and former Secretary Richard H. Battle spoke at the dedication of the Raleigh statue, the one that you sort of see on the sort of pedestal. What was a hot sort of and restless day, Battle told his audience that as governor, as Southern War Governor, Vance had used his sort of staunch resistance, it stood in staunch resistance to, quote, the unlawful encroachments from the authorities in Richmond, and that Vance's commitment, quote, to see that the laws of the state ensuring justice between man and man were obeyed, right? Again, the image of Vance as defender of civil liberty. On June 22nd, 1916, in Statuary Hall in Washington, D.C., Zebulon Vance's great-granddaughter pulled the string to unveil a statue of Zebulon Vance. And the speaker for that day, a North Carolinian by the name of William Hoke, described Vance on that day as, quote, a great leader of his people in war and in peace, great in intellect, great in character and achievement, great in the breadth of quality of sympathy. That's a lot to read, imagine saying, but it certainly impresses Vance's greatness upon his audience, while going on to continue to play the same chords of memory about Vance as defender of civil liberty and provider of his state. As recently as the 2015 rededication of the Vance Monument on Pack Square, this version of Zebulon Vance as War Governor of the South, an image that he cultivated, which simplifies the complex history surrounding the Civil War era in favor of a veneer of white unity, remains a common theme. And to be clear, Vance spent much of his adult life, in fact, the majority of his adult life, in service of the United States. Time and again, in the absence of a legislative legacy, however, public commemoration centers upon the Civil War and Reconstruction. Vance's public image remains very much that of war governor, redeemer, and humorist. And to sort of wrap up, I should say that there's nothing humorous or funny about the racial policies that serve as the backdrop for this commemoration of Zebulon Vance, or the overthrow of the local government or in Wilmington, or the disfranchisement of Black voters at 1900. Vance, in his history, in his personal experience, benefited from the institution of slavery. He defended the institution of slavery. He accepted emancipation, but he never changed his racial views. He led the fight against biracial government in Reconstruction, and he was not unique in that regard. But there were plenty of people in the South, even here in Asheville and Buncombe County, who had evolved in their thinking, who embodied a different historical experience. But their histories, their memories remain unfamiliar to us, or at worst, lost to us, hidden in the shadows of men like Zebulon B. Vance. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the other presentations and questions at the end.
Thank you, Steve. So our second speaker this afternoon is Dr. Dwight Mullen. You heard from Trevor Freeman that Dr. Mullen is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Political Science at UNC Asheville. What you did not hear is that Dr. Mullen and his wife Dolly are that rare academic couple that has a building on campus named for them. How many of us can say that? Today, Dr. Mullen will speak to us about the historical uses of Asheville's Pack Square for auctions of the enslaved. And in addition, Dr. Mullen will discuss prominent and notable figures in the history of Asheville's African-American community. So Dr. Mullen.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, it's since I retired, this teaching format is has evolved, and it left me out of the evolution. This is so strange for me to talk on screen like this, to not be able to communicate with eye contact with my audience, and to know where students are in understanding what I'm saying. So please bear with me. I'm a rookie at this, despite my gray hair. I'm very much a rookie at this. And what I wanted to do today was to talk about the memorial, and to talk about it unapologetically with Black eyes. How I see it, how it's been seen, and how it serves to, I think, to be seen by others. You know, and it runs the gamut. It's complex, as Dr. Nash has said. It's a vision that initially is rooted in a history of controversy that cannot ignore race. And so many times, you know, in my career at UNCA, one of my first public addresses was to deal with and to talk about Zebulon Vance and the memorial. It introduced me to a topic that at the time I was not familiar. I did a number of preliminary research efforts. I talked with individuals, and I want to reflect on some of those discussions I had back then and some of the uses of the memorial today. And most of those, you know, I mean, you know that the site is currently the site of that commemorated and pulled Asheville into the national discussion surrounding the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. We as a city participated in a national discussion through public demonstrations, because none of our public forums participated in this conversation. The Congress did not discuss it. The state legislature did not discuss it. The city council, county commission did not discuss it until the protesters brought it to the table. And they kept bringing it to the table at the base of the Zebulon Vance Memorial. This is no accident. To contrast the Black Lives Matter with a monument to white supremacy. To protest in the shadow of that has been actually a long-standing Asheville tradition. We can go as recently as I think one of the largest demonstrations in the history of the county occurred at the base of the memorial with the Women's Rights March in 2016. Thousands of people participated in that march. Thousands witnessed it. And it was one of those things that deliberately centered around the memorial as well as Pack Square, because the two are inseparable. So as you see demonstrations happening and the site of the memorial being a centerpiece, that is no accident. In that the symbolism of the memorial, as well as the location of it being on a main thoroughfare in Asheville, going east and west and north and south, brings public attention to the causes that are presented there. And those causes have ranged from the LGBTQ community to the anti-war. We're talking about the commemoration of the ending of world wars, World War I, World War II, even the gathering of veterans during commemorative days of Veterans Day, Memorial Day. It's even been the site of Christmas decorations. I don't know if some of you have been in Asheville long enough to remember how Christmas lights are strung from the top of the memorial down to the floor, looking like a Christmas tree. This kind of trivialization, this celebration of the celebratory positioning of the memorial is out of place with its actual history and symbolism. But for the city, it acts as a centerpiece. It's a centerpiece of communication and civic dialogue, as I think it is today. But we often will gather at his feet to talk about publicly and as a community a number of important topics that are presented to us. George Floyd being among the most recent, the murder of George Floyd being the most recent. But I remember also in, and some of you might remember, in 1997, that the memorial served as part of the demonstration of last rally of KKK in Asheville. The Ku Klux Klan used the site as part of its rally point from this around Pack Square. This is a city hall, the county building, the county courthouse, and then up past Zebulon Vance and through downtown, then back through and back past Zebulon Vance and back at the city buildings. And that is so symbolic of Asheville in terms of 25, couple dozen Klan members dressed in full regalia, some were dressed in militia garb, made that parade march while being greeted, if you want to say that, by 1,000, at least 1,000 Asheville residents who protested their protest, who protested their presence in the city. This is the kind of community dialogue that the Zebulon Vance, if it could speak, would remember and tell us about. But the site of that, the site of the memorial and its very physicality, I think needs to be talked about. It's not just a gathering place, and that symbolism, that look of it is not by accident. We're looking at, and I think that before I go into the symbolism, and let me talk about one more thing about it. I'm a political scientist. I can't let it go. As even in retirement, I find myself being more of a political scientist than anything. Is that the location of that monument is juxtaposed, it's on a square, and on one side of the square is government. It's politics. It's the center of elected power, appointed power. We have the Buncombe County Courthouse, both before it, we have the City Hall for local government. On another side, we have, and historically have been, commerce. We've had the major banks have had offices there. We've had law offices placed on another side of it. But this triumvirate, this square, I should say, of power is centered around the Zebulon Vance Memorial. And I don't think it's an accident. I think it's the center of the city. It's where not just dialogue has happened, but the actual policy formulation and policy implementations decided officially by the city. This is the site, the physicality. This is the place where de facto, where de jure segregation was locally ordained, sanctioned at the national level, again sanctioned at the state level, but formulated and implemented at the local level. And Zebulon Vance sits in the middle of it. The actual legal segregation by race occurred in the shadow of, and it was implemented in the shadow of the monument. And you say this occurred way after slavery. Well, what the monument maintains, it's not just enslavement, it's the monument to Jim Crow segregation, which we have not given a lot of attention to. But it's constructed, as was noted earlier by Dr. Nash, that at the beginning of the constitutional recognition as proposed by Plessy versus Ferguson, that separate but equal is okay. You know, we're in business with the policy at the national level for a couple of decades, and then the construction of this monument is taking place as a tangible representation of white supremacy. And if you have any question about that, part of my conversations with people who remember it, because you see, this is living memory in Asheville. We live in the South. The South keeps its memory, almost like no other place in the United States, but the South keeps its memory. And through living memory, I was told when I moved here that monument represented the place where I better not be found after sundown. Now, to be told to think of Asheville as a sundown town is inappropriate. You just don't think of it like that. But everyone knew that unless you were working in a hotel, unless you were working in a restaurant, unless you were working downtown, you had no business being on that side of downtown. And that Zebulon Vance Memorial was the physicality of that reminder. And so your part of downtown can't be seen from the Zebulon Vance Memorial. Your part of downtown as a Black person is located back behind the police station. It's the Eagle Market Street. The landmarkers there are not an obelisk. It's not something built by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. You have something built by the African American community, the Young Men's Institute, the YMI Cultural Center as it still stands. The Mount Zion Baptist Church is there. At the time of the building of that memorial, there was a Black downtown that was segregated from white downtown. Even now, you have to know what street to turn to get to that section of town. You have to know that life in the 20th century in Asheville was helped to be defined racially by that monument, because it gave you a landmark of where to be and where not to be. And so as we look at it with race in mind, and I don't think it can be looked at without race in mind, no matter how complex it is that we find it being a symbol of white supremacy and white domination. We talk about the construction of it and the maintenance of it and the keeping of it. It brings to mind some other things. But before we do it, let's talk a little bit more about that symbolism and the oppression that it represents. Is that in my eyes, and I thought it was just me, so I kept it to myself for so many years. And here recently, a conversation I had with one of my children, one of the kids, I call them, this new generation, these 20-somethings, this Black Lives Matter, these upstarters, these folk, they treat me like an elder, a senior citizen, as I am. I mean, they're right. But the point being is that they said, Doc, that symbol is Egyptian. I'm looking at them and say, how do you know that? I've kept this to myself. I haven't told you. They did their own work, and they saw the mysticism that was involved, that was recognized from the very beginning by the Masons who helped construct it and commemorate it. But that symbol is one that in ancient Egypt was designed, usually at a temple, to draw heavenly power, draw the earth's forces, to give power to those who it was commemorating. And so at the bottom of the obelisk, as you see it, this used to be, the nickname is a Cleopatra's Needle. But at the bottom of this obelisk, on all four sides, it says Vance. And so to draw that energy, earth force, down to commemorate and empower a white racist says so much to me as a Black man, is that the intentionality of it is clear and plain to me. And my acceptance of it has to be that of resistance. And so to resist that spiritually, to me, is very important. And so to work not just to end de jure segregation, as what was commissioned and commemorated and then inaugurated and legislated in the shadow of the memorial. Now we must move against de facto segregation. And the de facto segregation that memorial still represents is recognized, and so you have Black Lives Matter protesting in the shadow You have Black Lives Matter protesting in the shadow of it. That's an important point, very important point. But let's move on to the more on the physicality of it in terms of the square. You see, that memorial, even though it's constructed after enslavement, still saw the square being used in a racially oppressive way. I mean, to the fact even that there were segregated bathrooms at its base, segregated water fountains. There are stories being told that when the water fountains were first built, that signage had not been placed on them, and that white men would wait to see what Black people drank out of the wrong fountains when it was initially built. And there were severe beatings that were noted in the Asheville Citizen and Times newspapers. If you doubt any of those anecdotal stories, I can tell you from talking to my seniors who live in Asheville, of the intimidation and violence they experienced at the base of that monument as they attempted to walk by it, or they attempted to drink from the fountains there or use the bathrooms, and that the assault upon humanity. No, that monument is not passive. It is very, very, very alive and well, as it presents what it was originally designed to present, a world of white supremacy. And so for me, I look at it and I say, what can be done to it? And I'm disheartened, I'm discouraged. Because part of it involves a rededication. You have to understand that this thing is built 1897. It's rededicated with new plaques in 1938, and then again in 2015. And so you're talking now, people now. You're living with people now. Look at the plaque at the bottom to see who contributed to the renovation of the monument, who asked me what I thought about it. And I said, well, I don't contribute to it. In fact, I think that money should be used for some other kinds of things, to the tune of being able to raise $150,000 in the private sector to renovate that monument. And when it was renovated, we saw a new commemoration by the Masons, full ceremonial garb, as it was reestablished as a monument to Zebulon Vance. That is history. And that is part of why that monument's history is so controversial, because the individuals involved in that may or may not have realized what that thing looks like in from Black eyes. And so I present to you a couple of other points, is that the memorial, for me, presents a challenge. And that challenge involves recognizing that in its shadow, for example, you look at Pack Square, if you notice, if for those of you familiar with the physicality of the area, it sits on a square that the police department and fire department are on. And that street leads down to the Black downtown, Eagle Market Street. Well, right there at that juncture is a site where slaves were auctioned. And they were auctioned at that site so that they could walk over, and then individuals the enslavers who had bought, could pay their taxes right there at the county building. We're also talking about a site that years later, decades later, worked as a site for which day workers were picked up. African-American women would wait for day jobs to be offered, usually by white women. They would get in the cars and go and do the work, and then be dropped off later on in the evening. You're talking about that site being the site of a place where African-Americans felt alienated. They felt like this was not their place and not a place to be celebrated. And I think that if you polled African-Americans in the Asheville community, they would still feel like that this is not a place of their own. And so I would say to you that the marker itself gives us the directions. I think that when we look at the marker and we get past, that we remember that this is Robert E. Lee, and sitting, the commemoration for Robert E. Lee was sitting on Dixie Highway, and those markers are being removed. But we have to remember that as slave chattels were walked into the deeper South, this is the highway that folk took. You know, that goes past the commemoration at the base of this monument. And so, but we look at the monument and we say, well, maybe that it has something yet to teach us. Maybe something is instructive there, and it's this. And I'd like to end on this, and I'm looking forward to questions and discussion afterwards. Is that the quote at the bottom, I think, gives us instructions for how to consider it now. And it says, so that the future may learn from the past. That the future may learn from the past. Given my interpretation of that monument, given the history of that monument, given the violence of that monument, given the transition from one era of segregation to another era of segregation, from the formal legislative kind to the just generally culturally accepted kind, for me, that monument says what we should do. We should learn from this. The paradox of being a hero while simultaneously being an enslaver. The paradox of having a land of freedom while simultaneously providing for Jim Crow segregation. That context is no longer acceptable in the 20th century. And so we need to redefine it for ourselves. And the question becomes how? The question becomes how? And I'm looking forward to the discussion of how later on today. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Mullen. Our third speaker this afternoon is Dr. Fitzhugh Brundage. You heard from Trevor Freeman that Dr. Brundage is the William Olmsted Distinguished Professor of History at UNC Chapel Hill. What you did not hear is that he raises goats. Today, Dr. Brundage will speak to us about the memorialization of the lost cause and the Confederacy, as well as the history and possible future of monuments in general. Dr. Brundage.
Thank you very much. Going back to Steve's opening about being the leadoff hitter, well, it's hard to follow those two, and I'm such a bad baseball player that I'm not going to bring either home. So I'll do what I can here to address the commemoration of the Confederacy and place it in a slightly broader context, because as has already been mentioned, what's happening in Asheville is part of a much, much larger, not only national dialogue, but now we've seen an international dialogue about the commemorative landscapes that we have inherited. So I want to start off, and I too find it difficult to not be able to make eye contact with an audience, and that's going to be especially odd now when I share my screen with you all and lose virtually any sense of connection to you all. All right, I trust you see that image there of Monument Avenue of Richmond. I'm going to start off with this because I want to spend maybe 10 minutes, I hope, trying to emphasize the ways in which the commemoration of the Confederacy was part of a much broader commemorative impulse in the late 19th and early 20th century. And then circling back to what it was about the commemoration of the Confederacy that made it distinctive. There's more of the history of the commemoration of the Confederacy that is by no means distinctive. And I want to touch on that first. So the first point I want to stress is, as I've already said, there was a commemorative kind of frenzy between roughly 1870 and 1920 across the industrialized or the modern or the developed world, however you want to describe it. And so white Southerners actually perceived themselves as playing catch up. And they were very anxious that they had fallen behind not just their Yankee peers, but also their international contemporaries. And I want to emphasize that they had good cause to be anxious. So when we look at this image here of Monument Avenue, a grand boulevard, one of the grandest boulevards in the South, if not the country, and also one of the most audacious examples of Confederate commemoration, we may be struck by just how imposing it is. But I want to stress that it is modest by comparison to, let me see if I can get this to move forward here. Here we go. It is modest by comparison to, here we go. No, I'm frozen here. I don't understand that. Do you all see the next slide here?
We are not seeing the next slide.
Right.
If you
So
would.
I do not understand. I apologize for this technical delay here.
If you want to go ahead and stop your screen share and then reshare.
Yeah, I apologize, folks. I will stop. I think it may have timed out there. All right. And now screen share. This is next. I do not understand. All right. Why? So are you all just getting the UNC? I do not understand. This was working just a moment ago. All right, folks. We're going to just not do with any images at all. All right. I apologize for that. So I had I guess my image of Monument Avenue is up there. That's going to grace this for the remain. I guess I stopped sharing. So in any case, Monument Avenue. I wanted to contrast that with Washington, D.C., where, of course, there are nearly 30 very major sculptures depicting or commemorating Union generals. And indeed, any one of those roughly 30 Union generals the monument is of comparable size or even grander than any of the Confederate monuments on Monument Avenue. Or take the example of Gettysburg. And here, just imagine in your mind that you have an image of the Pennsylvania Monument at Gettysburg, which some of you may have actually seen, which is an immense, very grandiose monument. There's a very large New York monument, which is a long, very tall pedestal monument. There are roughly 9 Union monuments for every one Confederate monument at Gettysburg. And the Union monuments are much, much larger in general than those of the Confederate memorials. So the point of this is that Union memorials were as plentiful across the United States as Confederate memorials, and in certain hallowed spaces, they were far more conspicuous. So white Southerners saw themselves as being locked in this kind of commemorative arms race with their contemporaries. Now, Confederate commemoration didn't entail the development of any distinctive commemorative style or aesthetic vocabulary. In fact, it was together that Northerners and Southerners adopted the same kind of vocabulary, particularly the common soldier monument that we're most familiar with. To do so was in keeping with the desire in both the North and the South to find some way to create monuments that celebrated the valor of individual men in a mass war. And so they settled on the idea of monuments, not especially to generals. They of course, made some of those, but far more commonplace for these monuments to common soldiers. And again, I'd ask you to draw upon your memory, and you've undoubtedly seen plenty of Confederate soldier memorials. Well, they're almost identical versions, slight differences that only someone keenly interested in the differences would notice between the common soldier monuments that were erected in the North. The people who were responsible for erecting the Confederate monuments in the South were similar in most regards to the people who were erecting monuments elsewhere in the country. The driving force behind the erection of monuments, North and South, were voluntary groups, what we would now call perhaps NGOs or maybe special interest groups. To put it another way, is state and local governments were the recipients of monuments, not the patrons of them. North Carolina, for example, had no tradition of state-sponsored cultural patronage. So cultural voluntarism, not state intervention, was responsible for the monuments that we see across this state. Sometimes the state or local government could be coerced, cajoled, or pestered into giving some money. But overwhelmingly, the money that built the monuments that clutter our landscape and the landscape of most of the country came from voluntary groups. Now, these voluntary groups went out of their way to create the impression that the monuments that they were putting up had a groundswell of popular support behind them. So they wanted the monument to be perceived as a kind of spontaneous expression of organic enthusiasm. Now, sometimes there was a great deal of popular enthusiasm for the monuments, but many times the monuments were truly the product of these voluntary organizations and the elites who supported them. So monument creators took advantage of their capacity to raise funds to erect the monuments. They also took advantage of their capacity to get those monuments accepted by local leaders. And there, back then, and I'm saying back then in this, the golden age, if you will, the Renaissance of monument construction between 1870 and 1920, back then there was no formal approval process for the erection of most monuments. Instead, what happened was a local organization that usually was well connected to the leading figures in the community would propose a monument. It would be accepted. The monument would be built, would be gifted to the town fathers. There would be a dedication ceremony at which the organization that was giving the monument to the city gave it to the city. And usually all of these participants in these events shared family, business, or political ties. So for all of the appearance of the monuments being the product of a kind of voluntary and public tradition, a democratic tradition of public commemoration, in reality, it was only the influential and the well-heeled that were most likely to be responsible for the monuments on our landscape. And finally, virtually everywhere in the developed world, at the same time that Confederate memorialists were putting up monuments, virtually everywhere in the developed world, there was the idea that monuments should be didactic. Monuments should convey an eternal message to future generations. So no dedication speech was complete without some reference to the individual or the cause being honored, and that the memory of that individual or cause should never be forgotten. Now, here's where we get to what's distinctive about Confederate memorialization. The monuments, as we've heard, were an unabashed celebration of the Confederacy. They were an unabashed celebration of secession, and they were an unabashed celebration of Southern white civilization. I am unaware of any Confederate memorial, well, I can think of only one, but virtually unaware of any Confederate memorial that in any way hints at any regret about the Civil War, or any regret about the devastation caused by the war. Instead, these are monuments of defiance. These are monuments of unrepentant defiance. But in another regard, the kind of didactic purpose of these monuments was conventional. As I've said, virtually all over the world, builders of monuments of this era aspired to create monuments that would, to the end of time, teach a kind of timeless truth as they saw it. And it's this ambition, the ambition to pass on truth that was impervious to the passage of time or change, that now renders these monuments so problematic in our own era. These were monuments that were intended to cement a stark, a simple, and an unequivocal interpretation of the past. And they did so without any acknowledgement of any alternative understanding of the past, or of the possibility that lessons of the past might be ambiguous. So now in the 21st century, we've inherited this commemorative landscape. In this case of the South, one cluttered with Confederate monuments, but elsewhere in the country, a landscape that is sometimes jarringly inconsistent with our contemporary values. It's a landscape that doesn't reflect the diversity of our nation, because of course it was never intended to do that. And it largely reflects the perspective, the anxieties, and the values of the nation's elites. And our commemorative landscape, it's important to note, is preponderantly militaristic or military oriented. And here I would have showed you a slide with some numbers from North Carolina. And the simple point I would make is they're roughly we'll say the inventory of major monuments in the state, they're roughly 1,000 monuments. And of those, over 700 of them are war monuments. So roughly 7 out of 10 monuments in this state are commemoration of war. And I don't mean to suggest that that there shouldn't be those monuments. Nothing is intended to suggest that. But what I do want to emphasize is that apparently North Carolinians and Americans on the whole have shown comparatively little interest in celebrating civilian accomplishments, peacetime accomplishments, if you will. So what is the future of commemoration? Well, many artists and commentators have expressed serious reservations about the perpetuation of conventional memorialization in contemporary America. And here I wanted to show a slide of a performance artist in Baltimore who is using who used one of the pedestals from a removed monument in Baltimore to create her own living monument where she stood on top of it and attempted to, or aspired to, somehow memorialize everyone who had previously not been memorialized by a Confederate memorial in Baltimore. That's just one example of the kind of deep skepticism about the capacity of existing traditions of memorialization to really reflect the nation's diversity or our history's complexity. But at the same time that they're skeptics about the utility of monuments, there are still many, and I think there are probably more Americans who still hold monuments in high esteem, and they clamor for more monuments. And that gets us to another very important point. At the same time, we're asking ourselves what should be memorialized and what we should do with what we've inherited. We're also living in one of the great waves, the second great wave of the commemoration of commemoration in the United States. If you graph out when monuments have been built in the United States, the big surge is from 1870 to 1920. Then there's a lull from the 1920s into the 1970s. And then in the 1980s, but especially the 90s and 2000s, we've had another wave, the second great wave, as I've said. So, however our public spaces are maintained or expanded or revised in the near future, we're going to see a difference from the way it was done in the past, for sure. The deliberative and consultative procedures that were used now are markedly different from those from a century ago. Whereas most monuments in our public spaces went through very little, very tenuous approval processes, any future monument is going to be subject to laborious processes. And there I suspect you all in Asheville know more about that than I do. But I want to end here by making this larger point that as we consider our landscape, whether it's in Asheville and Pack Square, here on the campus of the University of North Carolina, I think we have to consider the need for a kind of triage. And this is a triage to figure out what monuments have to be relocated, revised, reinterpreted, whatever we deem appropriate. What needs to be done immediately, what needs to be done in the near future, and what we may not get to for a while. And the reason why is because we have the challenge of maintaining stamina and securing funding to revise a landscape that took more than a century to build. And it's going to be contentious. And we're going to have to figure out how to do it in a constructive manner so that it may promote comedy instead of divisiveness. I want to note here, that's why I think the offer of funding by the Mellon Foundation, some of you may have heard, the Mellon Foundation is proposing to spend roughly $250 million to promote the reimagining of America's commemorative landscape. And that's enormously important because that will make funding available to reimagine public spaces that doesn't necessarily have to come through public coffers, which in post-COVID America are likely to be depleted, to say the least. Finally, I think when we have these conversations, when we have these dialogues, whatever you want to call it, about our inherited landscape, it's likely to accentuate localism in ways that are surprising and discomforting, especially to people who want a kind of uniform national culture. It's going to mean that we have to acknowledge the messiness of history, the contradictions and the ambiguities of history. For example, those who are anxious about the erasure of the national past often suggest that we're now on a slippery slope. And that's going to conclude with the canceling of Washington and other heroes who defined American greatness and exceptionalism. And I'm sure those who would feel that way would point to the toppling of the statue of Lincoln in Portland. And here I was going to show you a slide of that toppled Lincoln statue. And that would seem to suggest we truly have reached the nadir. And I certainly don't want us to succumb to a kind of mindless iconoclasm. But at the same time, I think reflection about our inherited monuments are overdue. We can have, and perhaps should have, a discussion about whether it's appropriate to think of Lincoln as a genocidal white supremacist. The people who toppled the monument in Portland did so. Apparently, they spray painted on it, on the pedestal, Dakota 38, drawing attention to the fact that Abraham Lincoln approved the execution of 38 Dakota Indians in 1863 because of their participation in the Dakota Uprising. And so he approved the largest mass execution by the federal government in American history. So presumably the people who toppled the monument see Lincoln as a genocidal white supremacist. I don't share that view, but we should have that conversation. Likewise, we should have the conversation of whether Lincoln should be remembered as the great emancipator. Some of you may know there's the monument in Washington, D.C. of Lincoln as the emancipator that has become very controversial. Engaging in public dialogue about these questions will not erase the history of Abraham Lincoln, but it may deepen and broaden our understanding of the past. In my case, the greatness I see of Lincoln is conveyed most eloquently, most permanently in my mind, in the Lincoln Memorial. And you'll recall on one of the walls are his words from his second inaugural address. It's a memorial to a nation he envisioned and the words he used to give birth to that nation. So the Lincoln Memorial is a memorial to Lincoln, but it's also a memorial to the idea that he articulated better than, at least I think, anyone else in American history. But I can well understand why some Americans recoil at his role in the largest mass execution in the hands of the federal government in American history. And I can see why some people would recoil at a monument that celebrates him and not African Americans as emancipators. And so I'm going to leave it there. And like our other presenters, I'm going to look forward to whatever questions you want to pose.
Thank you, Dr. Brundage. This is an action-oriented meeting. It's a good marriage between history and politics and our future in Asheville. So let me just briefly return to the Vance Monument Task Force. As part of their continued work and the clear intention of the joint resolution that chartered them, the task force will hold 2 virtual town halls on Thursday, October 22nd and Thursday, October 29th. The public, especially those most impacted, is invited to call in and share your thoughts and opinions on whether to remove, relocate, or repurpose the Vance Monument. And you can do this a couple of ways. If you just want to tune into the meetings, you can go on your computer to publicinput.com/Vance Monument Task Force. publicinput.com/Vance Monument Task Force. And if you just want to tune in by phone, you would call the number 855-925-2801, and there's a meeting code, 9722. The number again is 855-925-2801. The meeting code is 9722. So that's a couple of instances where you can actually make valuable input to the task force itself. We have had some questions. First question is, can anyone speak to the importance of Pack Square in Native American history, or the issue of who the task force may consider for memorialization among other minorities or groups? I think there's a procedural aspect to this and a substantive aspect. Procedurally, the joint resolution focuses on African Americans for the task force, but there's still the larger substantive question of Native Americans and other minority groups. So does anyone want to tackle that one?
Just on from my very superficial knowledge, the memorial actually sits on a crossway, a road that was established by the Cherokee through the mountains. It was subsequently, I think, usurped by the white settlers as their trade route further south. But if you're looking at the monument and you're looking west down Patton Avenue, you'll come across in maybe 2 blocks down that was identified as a former burial ground for Native Americans, a Cherokee burial ground. It's right where, for those of you who are familiar, where the parking lot is for Asheville Bank. That was, we think, is a site for a burial ground. But this land that we occupy has not always been occupied by its present people.
Anyone else? We have a second question. Can anyone talk about Vance's friend Pack, as in Pack Square, who financed the monument with profits made, I guess, in the lumber industry during Northern labor struggles? Was Pack against the side of labor, and is that connotation attached to the monument?
I guess I'll sort of that's an interesting angle of it, which I actually have to admit that I have not looked into. You sort of follow Pack's career. My understanding was that he was a wealthy industrialist who lent significant money towards the creation of the monument. But it's an interesting concept, and I mean I would like to know more about it. I have not explored his career, so.
Anyone else on the subject of Pack? Next question. Why do you think there was Black Masonic involvement and inclusion if it was purposely built and meant as a symbol of white supremacy? I understand there were some black newspapers as well as white newspapers included in the time capsule. And black Masonic support.
Yeah, the Masonic history in North Carolina is troubled, in that it was deliberately kept separate, despite many attempts to bring the Black Masons with Masons, Freemasons together across the racial lines. And so you're talking about within the last 10 years, 15 years, have the organizations work cooperatively together. So to find the newspapers at the base of the monument, I think was surprising. And I'd like to hear my friend Marvin Chambers, who is a longtime Mason, explain that.
I guess I would add, it's an interesting question as to why local African American Masons or newspapers would be included. But on the other hand, I would sort of caution against sort of obviously sort of concluding that they wouldn't be interested. I mean, this was a massive sort of community event, and their desire to participate or their participation should not necessarily be broadly interpreted as a sort of support of the image and the sort of idea that was being projected by it. But in terms of you consider just how big of a community event that this would have been broadly, that this would have been one of the opportunities where perhaps they could participate. So I don't know that their participation. I don't, because I mean, I'm thinking of the funeral drive where they bring Vance's body back by train to Asheville. There were African Americans that crowded along the rail lines as well and wanted to sort of see the funeral procession. And it was a big event. It was a big deal. To be involved in it is, I think, a sort of matter of participation and perhaps even momentary sort of inclusion.
Very good. We have another question. I found in this Asheville City Directory of 1929 that the KKK met at 7.5 Northwest Pack Square, the site of modern day high-rise Hotel Aris. This would have been in clear view of the monument. Did the monument likely help to give them a sense of legitimacy at that location?
I guess I'll, that's an interesting, the sort of idea of the sort of, I think it speaks to what Dr. Mullen was talking about, which is with monuments, and what Dr. Brundage was talking about, which with monuments, it's as much about the people who put them up, but then their future use and how they've been sort of adopted and utilized. I don't think it's coincidental that they would sort of be close by. And as Dr. Mullen pointed out so ably, right, that Pack Square is the hub of everything within Center Asheville. So it's not just necessarily the monument, it's the location, the space that they are also wanting to get access to. That would be my initial thought.
Dr. Nash, I agree with you. And in fact, I'd like to add also that the controversy surrounding Zebulon Vance's participation role, his image with the Klan, how it's not clear at all whether or not the claim that he was a grand dragon of the Klan is true. We know that after the Klan hearings in Congress in 1871, that he, as so many Southern elites, disavowed the Klan. But I found later that around the building of the memorial that they claimed him as a member. And so whether or not he was a member of the Klan, as an explanation for why they would be so adherent to him is I think there's an area ripe for more research.
Right. I mean, I would just sort of piggyback off of that, which is the idea that, you know, Vance was such a powerful political figure that he didn't have to be a member of the Klan in order to sort of direct it and sort of benefit from what it was doing. He certainly, in his speeches at that time, would have been seen as sort of encouraging it, even if he would publicly then disavow, as many of the elites did, like, oh, we can't believe what they're doing.
Yeah.
And they would go give these speeches sort of talking about, you know, the threat of Negro domination in their words. So,
all right. Question, do any of you believe that it is appropriate to move monuments like the Vance Memorial in Asheville and the Jeb Stuart Monument in Richmond to other locations? Could a rural community without a substantial Black community become the location of a new monument avenue? Would it be a good idea for cities like Richmond or Asheville to shift their Confederate burdens to sites with few Black residents?
I'll offer a brief observation. There are, it makes me think of what was done with some of the monuments to communist figures in Eastern Europe and in the former Soviet Union. And I believe in Czechoslovakia, well, now the Czech Republic, I believe, Poland, Ukraine, Soviet Union, there are parks that have gathered Lenin and Stalin sculptures. I think the challenge with that is twofold. One is it's going to cost a lot of money to move a lot of these monuments, so it is not a small undertaking. And the second is I would be interested to know what's the why a community would want to take on that responsibility. However, it does strike me that there is no reason why the United Daughters of the Confederacy and or the Sons of Confederate Veterans could not create their own public space and start taking these monuments off the hands of Richmond or whatever other community wants to offload their Confederate memorials. So certainly I think a private organization could do that. I would wonder why a civic entity, a community, village, city would want to do it.
Another question. We're getting toward the end. We're gonna end in 5 minutes. Going to end at 5:30, but I think we may have time for at least a couple of questions. One, is it possible to keep the current physical structure of the monument and still create a new or revised monument that includes the entire community rather than excluding African Americans?
yes. I mean, it certainly would be possible to keep it. I think, as Dr. Brundage just pointed out, the cost involved in the questions of where to relocate it to. I mean, I can't speak, as Dr. Mullen did, to how different people feel about it and how their sort of response to it is, the personal responses that people have to it. I would love to see a sort of memorial landscape and a sort of commemorative landscape that speaks to a wide range of people and has the possibility to continue to grow, to encompass new voices and new people as they are sort of noted as being community and historically worthy of commemoration. And I know some from just a previous session with the task force, I know some of the things that they're proposing. But yes, it's entirely possible that it could be repurposed, reshaped. I'm not saying that I know that that's what it would be or could be, but it is possible.
Anyone else? Maybe the last question, is it important, and maybe everyone can, everyone on the panel can respond to this as a last question. Is it important to keep monuments to white supremacy, or at least a reference to it, to make sure we always remember the dangers of allowing such a thing to exist? I'm thinking of how the concentration camps in Europe are preserved not to celebrate them, but to serve as a warning to future generations.
If you don't mind, I'd like to address that. That's a point of discussion my wife and I frequently have in terms of deniability of future generations, that these things were as prominent and as influential as they actually were, because they're no longer there. They're no longer physically there to see. And and one of the things that about repurposing is that if we continue with the analogy of the example, I should say, of the concentration camps in Germany, when you go, you don't see symbols of Nazism. They're devoid of them. There are no flags. There are no statues. The few that you see are embedded in the wrought iron that might still exist. But in terms of flagrant symbols, that's just not in your face like it may have been back in the 1930s, 1940s. And so how do you divest that power of white supremacy from the Zebulon Vance Memorial? I don't know how that can be done. The sheer size of it at 75 feet is designed to make you look up at it. And how you change that conversation into one of community, I don't know.
Yeah, I think, as I've been watching what's been happening across the country with monuments, specifically Confederate monuments, one of the things I've thought about a fair bit and have been struck by is what's happened on Monument Avenue. The way that sort of artists and communities have sort of, painted them, used them as a point of, dialogue. It makes me think of the Berlin Wall in some ways, the way that an object of clear sort of oppression was sort of reclaimed by the people that it sought to control and, repurposed. I tend to agree. Can it be done? Oh man, that's hard.
Yeah.
I look at something like the Berlin Wall and I look at what was happening in Monument Avenue, and I could maybe, yeah. It's such a hard conversation.
I'll try to do this very quickly and say that I certainly think that some of the Confederate memorial, depending on what individual communities decide to do with the monuments they've inherited, I hope that some will be preserved, but we have hundreds and hundreds of Confederate memorials in North Carolina, we have over 200. It's not clear to me that we need all 200 to do that purpose of sort of ensuring that there isn't any deniability about these monuments. So I could well see examples of Confederate monuments being preserved in state museums where they are interpreted appropriately, the same way that state museums may preserve signs for white bathrooms, for quote unquote colored bathrooms from the age of segregation. We certainly need to save some of them for that purpose, but we have many more than we need for that purpose.
So thanks everyone for your questions. We couldn't take them all, but we got as many as we could. I'm going to give the floor now back to Trevor Freeman for a wrap up.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you very much for everybody that participated today, our speakers and our audience as well. As Jim said, we had so many questions coming in there at the end, we couldn't even begin to get all of them answered. A lot of great comments as well. As Jim noted also, there is that, the avenue for public forum, public discussion with the Vance Monument Task Force. So if, this has spawned any interest in community dialogue and community engagement around this issue or these issues, then we hope you were able to catch the links or catch the address of the avenues for that in the future. So again, thank you all very much for participating. We'd like to thank all of our panelists. We'd like to take, they took time out of their busy schedules to share their insights and research, and I'd like to thank Jim as well for moderating the flurry of questions coming in there. And also really want to thank UNCA's OLLI program for their expertise and all their behind the scenes work on hosting this event. It would not have been possible without them. This event will be made as a recording and it will be made available shortly. So if you're registered for this event, you'll automatically get a link to that recording. Also want to urge you to check back in with the Western North Carolina Historical Association website, our event page at wnchistory.org/events. Has our upcoming programs, and it will be updated accordingly as we develop new ones. We feature lectures, book discussions, hikes, paddles, and many other programs related to Western North Carolina history. And if you enjoyed today's program, you may also consider becoming a member of our organization, which gives you free or discounted access to numerous programming opportunities throughout the year. So again, that's a big thank you to everyone. It's going to do it for today, but we hope that you learned and enjoyed this event. Thank you.